the land has always been altered by animals, whether historically by megafauna or by keystone species such as beavers, wolves, or elk. The land has always been shaped by the animals that live upon it. And whilst the landscape is a dynamic entity, it could be argued it is more passive in the relationship between it and the animals that live upon it. The animals upon a landscape alter plant growth, influencing what plants can flourish and where they can become established, and thus influencing and changing the very shape of that landscape. This is further exacerbated by the presence of a keystone species. Keystone species are plants or animals that impact an ecological community beyond what their population numbers would suggest. They play a crucial role in maintaining a balance within an ecological community. They affect other organisms and impact the numbers and varieties of other species within their ecological communities. Without them, the system can collapse or become altered dramatically, restricting everything from the flora and fauna to the variety and resilience of the habitats in question. Some keystone animals, such as wolves, are also apex predators, but a keystone species does not need to be a predator. Beavers, for example, are a keystone species due to the wetland habitat they create through their dam building. Man is no different to any other animal in this respect. We affect and influence the land through our very presence. Man only possesses a greater degree of agency. Man is a keystone species, creating habitats and environments that bias or limit certain plants and animals. However, we typically operate beyond the level of influence or impact that the landscape and its animal populations can sustain, thus leading to environmental decline. But the Scottish landscape is often not seen as a managed or damaged entity. The issues of serious environmental degradation are things that happen in other countries over the horizon. We conflate issues of ownership with issues of environmental stewardship, and we never truly address the real problems. The myth of the wild and rugged Scottish Highland landscape is romanticised, and therefore our view of how that landscape should naturally exist is a skewed one. We may believe that we've outgrown the issues of environmental damage and degradation of our landscapes and wild spaces in Scotland, but that narrative is a flawed one. Our baselines for comparison are too narrow and our time horizons too short. I hope to explore the reasons as to why Scotland has such a heavily man-altered landscape, and why, through sense of identity and narrative, that fact has become comfortable for us to ignore. The landscape moves in centuries and epochs, unless willed into faster action by natural disaster or the actions of those who live upon it. The landscape has a time horizon that extends far beyond that of any single human lifetime. And one could easily, with the distance of time, imagine a past when man lived in harmony with nature, respecting the land and the life it supported, and living closely to nature's cycles and circadian rhythms. Whilst we will never know the truth of our forefathers' beliefs or societal structures, we do know that as a keystone species, man has always altered and impacted our landscape. We think of the Anthropocene and the changing of the landscape by man's hand as a modern phenomenon. As a keystone species, we have always altered the landscape beyond what our population numbers would suggest. The major series of events and developments that ultimately led us to the Anthropocene begin as far back as the Mesolithic era. The Mesolithic to Neolithic transition marks the move from a hunter-gatherer-based culture to one of more established farming within Eurasia. Because this is marked by the development of material culture, it emerges at different time periods depending on your location. But typically this occurs around about 8,000 years BCE across Northern Europe. Whilst there is much debate about the precise timings and the mechanisms that led to this period of change within Scotland, what we do know is that farming has emerged and become established in Scotland by 3900 BCE. These farming communities were obviously not the first people to inhabit what is referred to as the Great Caledonian Forest. But the impact of those earlier hunter-gathering cultures is impossible to know. These early farmers kept grazing livestock, such as cattle, goats, and primitive forms of sheep. To create space to raise their stock, they engaged in a process of deforestation. Pine woodland and heath was burnt to encourage fresh growth of heather for grazing and to clear land for crops. These dual pressures of burning and overgrazing by livestock pushed woodland into decline and prevented natural succession and regrowth from occurring. Whilst the full extent of the impact of these emerging farming communities can never be fully known or measured, it is accepted that they had a profound impact on the environment they found themselves in. The Mesolithic marks the change in man's societal structure. As we moved and progressed from hunter-gatherers to farmers, this change multiplies the agency that we exert on the landscape as we begin to comprehensively manage that landscape. Through cultivating crops and raising livestock, as we develop as a civilization, the power of our agency is further multiplied as the tools at our disposal for exploiting our natural resources proliferate and increase in their potency. This multiplying of agency increases the weight on the ecological community that we express as a keystone species, ultimately impacting all facets of that community. This trend for deforestation in Scotland has continued ever since. Over the centuries, as the need for timber for either construction or fuel increases as our population grew, the need for more farming land to support that population also increases, all leading to the fractured pockets of woodland that are now the geriatric remnants of that ancient woodland as we know them today. And the activities that initiated this change in our environment, albeit in much more refined and evolved forms, continue to this day in the commercial and conservation activities of land management and Scottish estates.
Step we gaily on we go, heel for heel and toe for toe, arm and arm we go, off a Mary's wedding. Over hillways, up and down, Myrtle Green and back and round, pounds a shilling through the town, off the sake of Mary. Step we gaily on we go, heel for heel and toe for toe, arm and on we go, off a Mary's wedding. Plenty herring, plenty meal, plenty meat to fill the reel, plenty
To understand how the current state of the Scottish Highlands and our upland moors came about, you have to understand what came before. A long series of interconnected events and influencing factors came together and led us inevitably to the wild and sparse monoculture we now know. Before the 1745 Jacobite uprising, a laird's wealth and power were measured by the number of men he could raise from his estates and holdings. People lived in townships and practiced a form of subsistence farming utilising the archaic run rig system. It was inefficient both economically and from a food production standpoint. Individual households were allocated runs by the laird's agents, who were known as tacksmen. The runs were both narrow and held for short periods of time, so there was little means or impetus to better the land and make it more productive. Livestock were kept. Tenants, practicing the shieling system, drove their livestock to higher pastures for summer grazing and then brought them to the lower pastures and usually housed them within their own homes during the harder winter months. The common conception is that the pre-clearance farmer kept cattle and the sheep came later. The narrative goes that as the need for more profitable use of land occurred, people were forced from their homes and to make way for the sheep that were brought in to replace them. This is not a fully accurate picture. In Dr. Johnson's Journey to the Western Isles, published in 1773, he lists the livestock of a Highland tacksman as 100 sheep, as many goats, 12 milk cows and 28 beeves ready for the drovers. Now, whilst this account is after the uprising, it is early enough in the first stage of the clearances to be an accurate account of what would be a common collection of livestock at the time. While sheep are present and in some numbers, they are native breeds, with goats being equal in number. Cattle are being reared, but not in the numbers one would expect if they were the main livestock of the Highland farmer. This is important because it illustrates that overgrazing of upland moors was prevalent before the overpopulation of deer that would later occur, and that the impact of sheep for overgrazing predates the clearances. When we also look at other contemporary records of the time, such as General Roy's 1747 to 1752 maps of the Highlands, then we can see that the sparsity of naturally grown woodland is already evident. We can also use these detailed records of the Highlands not only to track the migration of people from the centre to more developed towns and to the coasts, but also the prevalence of what would be the precursor of a managed plantation stand, what at the time was known as deer forests. A multitude of polarising and complex factors led to the clearances. Large tracts of land were cleared and townships were amalgamated to create larger sheep farms that had the potential to yield higher rents for the landowners. Those who were pushed from their homes and the communities were even encouraged to take up alternative industries, such as fishing or kelp on the coast, or onto smaller crofts that were not large enough to support the tenants that found themselves there. Now, whilst the turmoil created after the uprising and the imposing of the 1746 Dress Act were arguably contributing factors towards the clearances and were one of the multitude of factors that motivated the ensuing mass emigration that eventually followed, one thing it is inarguably responsible for was a deeply polarised, toxic social and political backdrop for those clearances to play out on. The densifying of the population created the blank map required to establish the larger fields and pastures required to keep the large herd sizes of the new breeds of sheep being introduced from south of the border. The kelp industries and the growth in sheep farming were not, however, successful enterprises. With the end of the Napoleonic War, the demand for those materials fell dramatically. This, coupled with the impatience or the financial inability of the landowners to wait for the sheep herds to grow to a commercially viable size, meant that new forms of income were needed in the Highlands. The 1831 Game Act was a loosening of the laws surrounding hunting. It opened the doors to large numbers of people engaging with the activity. This new opportunity meant that the elite class of Britain could become patrons of the estates, and commercial hunting in Scotland could begin. But the tipping point could be said to have been around 1876. In J.A. Symon's Scottish Farming Past and Present, he lists the livestock numbers to have peaked at that time and have fallen from a high of over 2,187,000 to 1,600,000 by 1914. An early such example can be found in the Currer estate, who established their shooting lodge in 1857. The number of sheep falling from that time on the estate and the acreage set aside for deer forest increasing from 14,500 to over 34,000 in only 8 years. As the popularity in field sports grew, as did the need for sheep numbers to fall to allow for the unexpectedly fast growth in the deer population to continue. Thus the day of the sheep was a short one. The modern Scottish estate is bound to the path laid by the events that occurred in the 18th and 19th centuries. Any effort to alter or better the landscape now can only be done within a certain degree of radiance from that path. Further to the actions of our forefathers, today's land managers are also restricted by other factors significantly more local in time. Government policy, agricultural subsidies, tenant farmers, the wider economy and the availability of capital all have their part to play in influencing how our landscapes are managed. Land management, especially in the upland context, is an incredibly long-term project. And the influencing factors I've alluded to are significantly shorter in their scope of time than what the landscape needs for its processes to be influenced. Thus, an estate may operate to a 5-year business plan, but still has to consider 30, 60, 120-year timescales in planning its commercial and conservation works. For example, an estate may enact an afforestation programme, planting stands of timber as a commercial crop, but will not see the payoff from this investment until a 60-year growth cycle has completed. Some activities are benefited, whilst others are hindered by these external factors, each of them trying to enact their agency over those who are custodians or managers over our landscapes. Westminster government policy does have its part to play, but as land reform is a devolved power, the Scottish Executive through that reform is perhaps trying to encourage change. But the estates do report that those reforms are in fact inhibiting some investment and development. These multiple competing factors are all balanced by those who have the keys to those estates and who manage our landscapes. But through the continuation of these activities, man inhibits the natural cycle of succession on the landscape. By burning upland moors for grouse shooting, for example, one prevents natural regeneration of woodland. Man prevents plant succession. We hold our upland wild places in a state of arrested succession, a monoculture of plants so poor that they can support very few animals, and those that they do support are chosen specifically for the sport they offer. It may be seen as a managed hillside, but it is a farm. It is a farm to produce an abundance of a certain type of animal, chosen as the target of sporting activities. It is no different to any farm, as all farming creates a monoculture, whether it be of crops or of pastures for livestock. And again, the narrative is only ever simplified. The same simplification that tells us our upland moors and these wild open spaces are in the natural state are also the ones that tell us that those managing our landscapes are doing so only for their sole benefit and profit, and they do not consider the wider conservation implications or the people who live on and around those landscapes. The narrative surrounding those estates is very similar to the narrative surrounding the layers that they have replaced. That they are kings over their domain and they can enact sweeping changes at their whim. Whereas the reality, as always, is significantly more complex and nuanced than that.
Scots wha hae wi' Wallace bled, Scots one Bruce has often led. Welcome to your gory bed, or to victory. Now's the day and now's the hour. See the front of battle lour. See approach proud Edward's power. Chains and slavery. Wha will be a traitor knave? Wha can fill a coward's grave? Wha say base as be a slave? Let him turn and flee. Wha for Scotland's king and law? Freedom's sword will strongly draw. Freemen stand or freemen fall. Let him on with me. By oppression's woes and pains, by your sons in several chains, we will drain our dearest veins, but they shall be free. Lay the proud usurpers low, tyrants fall in every foe, liberties in every blow. Let us go or die.
When we think of the Highlands of Scotland, we all conjure a fairly defined image of what that landscape and its identity is. It is a land of ancient traditions and long heritage. Simple, hardy, yet infinitely capable people populate this rugged environment. Whilst everyone will have their own personal interpretation of this idealistic and romantic image, it will follow a trope that will be instantly recognisable by anyone who has ever heard of Scotland. But this image, this form of Highlandism, is a fiction. A deeply popular one, but one that you'd be hard-pushed to find anyone who would argue that it is a truthful representation of the Highlands or its cultural past. Scotland as a nation was not a unified country. United neither by politics or faith, through allegiance or shared cultures, Scotland was a fractured and divided nation. There was not a single identity that Scots could call their own, but rather a tapestry that could be roughly divided into Highland and Lowland. In fact, the image of the Highlander before the suppression following the uprising was one of uneducated lawlessness. Lowlanders feared and derided their northern cousins as much as the English did. This can be seen in cartoons of the time, such as the infamous Sonny of the Bog House from 1779, where the cartoonist James Gilroy mocks the Highlanders' lack of civility by not even knowing how to go to the toilet. But where did the unifying Highlandist national identity come from then? It begins to emerge in the vacuum that was created following the suppression of the region after the failed Jacobite uprising. Tartan and any form of Highland dress had been banned following the 76 Dress Act. Victoria Hendricks writes that Highland dress was singled out by its exoticness for its association with the Jacobite movement, and as such was used as a tool to crush it. The Proscribing Act legislated against many facets of the Highlands, but most notably against the wearing of any part of Highland dress. This was in an attempt to dissolve the Highland culture that was distinctly different to that of not only England, but of the lowlands of Scotland. This systematic disassembly of the Highland Gaelic culture created a void, a loss of identity that would take generations and works of published fiction to begin to heal. The early beginnings of Highlandism can be found in the epic poem The Ossian Cycle by James Macpherson. This supposedly discovered and translated work is published within the decade following the uprising, but will become an influential piece for the writer who did most to invent this image of Scotland. Sir Walter Scott, through his early epic poems, but most notably through his novels, creates and invents this Highlandist image of Scotland and shapes how the country will be seen not only by itself, but by people around the world for centuries to come. By the time the infamously staged visit of King George IV to Scotland had occurred, Scott was already a wealthy and successful novelist. Waverley and Rob Roy, amongst a prodigious number of other novels and shorts, had cemented not only his own personal fame and fortune, but had invented this new image of Scotland. For all of his faults and critics, Scott's genius lies in how he treats this historical subject matter. Juliet Shields writes that Scott's novels took as their subject matter some of the most contentious moments in Scottish history. Moments in Scottish history. Rather than stirring up these conflicts, Scott laid them to rest, in part by transforming political into cultural differences. This nullifying of the complex web of the Scottish social and political landscape was exceedingly popular, creating a unified, albeit fictional, identity at the time. Scott was not without his critics for doing so. Even his own son-in-law was critical of his portrayal of Scottish national identity. But the identity wrought in Scott's works stuck. It was distinctive, yet loyal to the crown. It allowed Scots to have an image, an identity that was their own, without being branded as rebels. The success and popularity of this image was cemented into history by the adoption of Highlandism by Scott's two most famous fans, Queen Victoria and her consort, Prince Albert. Now, there's much criticism levied at Victoria for her adoption of Highlandism, and for Albert for his creation of Balmoral as a crass fantasy based on the image created and popularised by Scott. But to do so, I feel, belittles the sophistication of her political manoeuvring. She inherited a disunited kingdom. The Napoleonic War may have been over, but the scars and the conflict and the social division in Scotland created by the clearances, coupled with the fear that a French-style revolution could still occur within Britain, were very real. She needed a way to unite Britain without a dangerous forced integration of the Highlands into British culture. She was also acutely aware of the power of what political spin doctors today call optics. By adopting Scotland as her country and establishing the first royal home in Scotland, she made the strange and the unusual romantic and popular. She made what was once another country her country, and she communicated this through image and spin. By commissioning Edwin LandSEARED to document the exploits of the royal family in a way that aligned with the worlds created by Scott and his literature, she creates the optic that this was not only a truthful representation, but it was one that was instantly recognisable by the public. Victoria and Albert's portrayal of life at Windsor and at Balmoral could not have been more different. Windsor was formal, controlled and sophisticated, whilst Balmoral was rugged, simplistic and romantic. These images were carefully curated by Victoria. These were not naive fantasies of a regal bubble. They were fictional in what they portrayed, but she understood that. In her journal, she writes of LandSEARED's sketch titled Queen Victoria Landing at Loch Mick. The picture is intended to represent me as meeting Albert, who's been stalking whilst I have been fishing. The fact that she refers to the commissioned artwork as intending to represent, to me suggests an awareness that this image is a fiction, but that it aligns the monarchy with an emerging unified Scottish identity. It is irrelevant if that identity is a fiction. If politically it creates a unification and allegiance to the monarchy, then politically, adopting Highlandism is a shrewd move. But this royal endorsement only solidifies the popularity of Highlandism, and it creates the tropes that are internationally recognisable and deeply popular to this day.
There! Are you serious?
What are you waiting for?
Tommy, this is not natural, man.
So if we accept that Highlandism is a pure fiction, and there are very few people that would argue to the contrary, then why is it so pervasive? Why does it exist, and why is it so popular as a national identity for Scotland today? If the same act or narrative is repeated from generation to generation, it becomes tradition. And the Highlandist view of Scotland has now become such a tradition. As an image of national identity, Highlandism is as flattering as it is beguiling. It is deeply popular both locally and internationally. So even from a sheerly economic point of view, continuing this form of Highlandism, this image of Scotland, is incredibly important for us as a nation, for our economy. Highlandism continues to exist today for the very same reasons it was so successful to begin with. It is a simple, uncomplicated and romantic narrative. It allows us to have pride and be unified as a people within our country by focusing on our culture, whether it be an invented form of that culture, rather than the political differences and the difficult questions that surround them. To question this narrative, to question Highlandism, is essentially to score a home goal, to attack national identity, rather than to question the authenticity and truthfulness of that identity. And this blinkered vision that Highlandism creates for the majority, I believe, creates the myopic view of the actual landscape itself. If you were told that the wide open space is a truthful, romantic, rugged and exciting place, then that's what you will see. And with the density of population in Scotland still being as it is, with the majority of us living within the central belt, the rural experience is still that of the tourist. And as such, Highlandism is the narrative you experience. Highlandism isn't part of daily life for those who do live rurally in the Scottish Highlands. You will not find them living out the lives portrayed in Scott's novels. But for the rural economy, Highlandism is deeply important, as those economies are underpinned by a bedrock of tourism that is based on that image. This is possibly set to change as the climate emergency brings people's attention to these issues. But as I've also previously alluded to, with land reform in Scotland being as it is, and with the politics of Scotland still being of the elite owning the land being the problem, as opposed to what they're doing with that land, then the legislation is possibly skewed to the wrong agenda in my mind. But this simplifying of the view of the Scottish Highlands holds not only the landscape, but also its people and its economy in a strange sense of arrested succession. Both deliberately and unintentionally, they are playing the parts cast in Highlandism. This both sustains the economy through tourism, but also prevents development. You cannot be both Silicon Valley and local hero at the same time. But this pandering to the stereotype, both for others, but more importantly for ourselves, inhibits progress.